Enemy declared victory too soon. Humans weren't done yet. Red warning bulbs pulsed along the automated bulkhead lines. Colonel Sarah Vance slammed her back against the terminal frame, her fingers catching the slick grease of a leaky hydraulic line. Laser fire from the heavy droids tore the iron door apart, throwing white sparks across the floor. Her squad was gone, and her rifle was empty. Ahead sat the primary mass reactor, glowing with a thick light that turned her cracked visor gray. The activation screen showed the sequence was almost done, and the enemy declared victory too soon. They believed the fortress world would fire on Nova Prime within minutes. Vance pulled her last energy cell from her vest and shoved it into the emergency lock. The droids rounded the blast corner, their heavy metal tracks thudding against the metal floor plates. Vance did not look back at them. She reached for the primary override lever, but the remote command cables had been cut from the outside. The system needed a person to stand at the platform and hold the hydraulic latch by hand until the core inverted. If she let go, the safety loops would reset, and the station would destroy the Alliance worlds. Her thumb touched the activation key, and the terminal grid hummed. The records don't track how many steps she took to reach that lever. Stay on this wire. The terminal is clearing. 15 years ago, Admiral Marcus Kane stood inside a dark room at the Aegis Command outpost, watching the starlight grids die. The starlight was thin, filtered through the salt-crusted ports of a station that had not been painted since the first siege. The regional alliances were broken, and 80% of the sector sat under occupation. Then, a low chime echoed from a terminal key that had been cold for a decade. The screen shifted from red to green, showing an archaic signal string from the deep vacuum. Kane did not call his staff. He reached down, tapped the ancient transmission logs, and sent a 6-word reply across the cold relay networks. He told the dying sectors that help had received their call. Overlord Zorith monitored the strategic telemetry maps from his high throne inside the world breaker. His mechanical respirator clicked once, the heavy thud of the pump shaking his biografted armor segments. The mathematical models on his glass displays had predicted a total Alliance surrender by morning, with 0 ships left in the outer sectors. Then, a line of blue contacts broke through the uncharted fringe of the Perseus Void Gulf. The contacts did not look like standard cruisers. They were wide, flat blocks of industrial iron, moving in a tight wedge that spanned thousands of kilometers across the dark. Zorith adjusted his tracking grid twice, but the numbers stayed constant. 100,000 human warships were burning through the vacuum, and they were not slowing down. Kane stood behind the main bridge rail of the flagship, his cybernetic eye whirring as it locked onto the Dominion line. The enemy had deployed 20,000 heavy vessels to block the approach to the inner capital. They opened fire together, throwing a wall of plasma that lit up the viewing ports like a new star. The human ships did not scatter. Their quantum barrier shields caught the plasma, absorbing the white heat and turning the foreign energy back into localized battery power. Kane did not order a counter-salvo. He looked at his helm master and gave a single order. The supercarrier Earth Guardian accelerated, ramming directly through the main defensive division without deceleration. The iron hulls collided in absolute silence. The human carrier tore through 3 cruisers, its thick nose splitting their armor plates like brittle glass and scattering fuel slag across the dark field. Behind it, the rest of the armada kept its shape, their blue shields cutting the enemy line into small pockets of dead metal. The Dominion command channels fell apart as the frequency shields jammed their relays. Zorith's staff began sending retreat indicators, but the human fleet was already past them, heading toward the asteroid fortress at full combat speed. Vance watched the hangar lights grow large through the narrow viewport of the Shadow Lance. Her 30 soldiers sat in the dark behind her, their fingers checking the seals on their armor plates. The ship was covered in a matte black hull panel coating that absorbed the light of the stars and left 0 heat signature for the tracking arrays. The primary battle outside had drawn every sensor beam away from the lower maintenance vents. Vance took the stick, cut the main thrusters, and steered the matte black craft through the blind spot of the station's cooling shafts. The magnetic docking shoes grabbed the outer plating with a dull metal thud that vibrated through her boots. The hatch dropped, and the 30 operatives stepped into the industrial arteries of the enemy installation. The air inside smelled of recycled sulfur and the mineral bite of filter units. They moved through the pipe alleys without talking, their small scanners killing the local cameras before the central grid could log the drop. The core was down through the transport tiers, and they had exactly 1 hour before the primary weapon cleared its loops. They reached the central transport junction when the first group of security droids dropped from the ceiling track. Red lasers cut the air, melting the iron walls and turning the floor tiles into white liquid. Vance did not look for cover. She fired her disruption charges into the center of their line, blowing 3 tracks off the lead unit. Her squad advanced through the smoke, their short rifles firing in rounds of 3 until the main platform was clear. But the noise had tripped the backup arrays, and the iron gates ahead began to slide shut. 3 wounded human soldiers dropped their packs against the lower hinge of the main door, their armor leaking fluid onto the tracks. They jammed their spent rifles into the gear teeth, checking their sidearms as the backup legion entered the far end of the hallway. Vance reached for their collars, but the sergeant shook his head and pulled the manual release pin from the frame. The gate dropped halfway, locking her squad inside the core sector and leaving the 3 men to hold the line alone. The sound of short-range fire exploded behind the iron wall, then died. Vance led the remaining team onto the reactor walkway, where the planetary mass core spun inside its blue containment fields. The energy storm inside was loud, throwing a constant high-pitched whine that made her ears bleed against her helmet foam. The team engineer scrambled to connect the remote overload scripts to the terminal nodes, but the system's screen flashed yellow. The station had deployed a hard security lock that could not be bypassed with software. The override required a hand on the console latch until the internal hydraulics drained completely. The squad looked at the screen, then back at her. Vance unlatched her primary harness, dropped her spent rifle on the grating, and walked to the handle. She looked at her remaining men and told them to get to the ship. They stood for a moment, their hands touching their helmets in a quick salute before they broke for the lower evacuation vent. She was alone when the inner doors broke apart under the droid's tracks. Vance locked both hands around the iron latch, her weight throwing the manual valve down into the floor housing. The metal grew hot against her gloves, the smell of burning cloth filling her visor as the core energy rose. Overlord Zorith entered the chamber behind his guard, his respirator clicking fast through the smoke. He stopped at the edge of the walkway, his obsidian armor reflecting the white glare of the failing fields. He looked at her screen and told her that she had already lost his empire. Vance looked past him, her eyes catching the stars through a cracked section of the outer viewport. She could see the human fleet, their blue shields forming a wall around the Alliance worlds. She looked at the giant gray form of the tyrant and smiled. She pulled the safety clip from the latch, letting her body weight slide the lever into the terminal seat. The reactor entered a critical cascade failure, its blue fields turning into a sharp white light that swallowed the walls, the droids, and the throne. Admiral Kane watched the mission feed on his primary bridge deck, his cybernetic eye tracking the telemetry strings as they turned from blue to black. The connection severed, leaving nothing but dead static on the center map. He stood still for 30 seconds, his arms folded behind his back as the bridge crew stopped talking. Then, the viewports flashed with a white light that outshone the distant sun. The world breaker broke into 2 burning halves, its asteroid crust splitting open like a dry shell. The internal fusion flare expanded across the sector, vaporizing 20,000 enemy warships that sat within its deployment zone. The planet-killing weapon vanished, its iron fragments melting into the dark vacuum until the entire field went silent. Kane did not order a victory salvo. He reached out, touched the screen toggle, and shut down the tracking grid with a simple click. The spreadsheets had promised the enemy an empty sky, but they had received an armada of ghosts who remembered how to strike back. Months later, the new alliance built a granite wall on the high bluff overlooking the capital city of Nova Prime. 30 names were cut into the stone, each letter deep enough to hold the rain. The sun was hot against the granite, and the wind carried the clean smell of new grass from the valley below. A piece of warped matte black hull plating sat at the base of the monument, its surface cold and unreflective under the open sky.